I want to come back to the present of the USA today and show you a few slides quickly here. This is the work that Ann Case and I have been doing on deaths of despair, and we define those, or at least it was Ann who had the idea of calling them deaths of despair. And these are accidental drug overdoses, suicides, and deaths from alcoholic liver disease, which have risen rapidly in the US since the mid-1990s. There were 158,000 in both 2017 and 2018. So there's two very surprising and important things going on here. The first is that this increase is confined to those who do not have a 4-year college degree. So this is the most stunning thing that came out of our work. And, you know, we weren't looking for an education link. It's just we were looking at 40 million death certificates, and you look at things, there's not that much on the death certificate, but it does tell you what their highest educational qualification is. And the thing you want to keep in mind, and when we're talking about inclusion and exclusion and the happy few and the people left behind, only 1/3 of Americans, adults, have a college degree, have a 4-year college degree. The other 2/3, the majority, twice the size, do not. One of the things, I just mentioned this because the press still gets this wrong to this day. They say we wrote about men dying from deaths of despair. The increase is the same for men and women. But the prejudice against people dying of drug overdoses and suicides and so on is such that they're seen as men doing it. And the press will say over and over and over again, this is men, it's not men. And anyway, let me not get carried away by that. The key here to us, and the argument we make in our book, is that the labor market jobs for people without a 4-year college degree has been just vanishing, has been sort of going away. And this failing labor market has brought social dysfunction in many forms, in many communities around America. Let me skip the next slide, but I wanted to show you here that I showed you this failing life expectancy. If you actually draw this graph for people without a 4-year degree and with a 4-year degree, this is how many years of life you can expect to live at 25. Look how this gap has widened since the early 90s from 2.6 years to 6.3 years in 2019, and that's before COVID. The worst thing, which is just unimaginable in some ways, is that since 2010, they've actually been going in different directions. So life expectancy, adult life expectancy has been falling for people without a 4-year degree. In spite of a medical care system that costs twice as much as any other healthcare system in the world, the majority of people without a 4-year degree have falling life expectancy. It's something that hasn't been seen in the United States for more than a century. Let me skip that because I want to connect it up with what Bishop Frank said. We think this is fueled by a declining labor market, by jobs that really gave meaning to people's lives, gave them a chance of promotion. You could work for a large corporation, you might be starting in the proverbial mailroom. I don't think they exist anymore. I guess there's no email rooms anymore. But you could start as a janitor or an elevator operator. Remember when there were those? Or in the food services department or the ground staff. And if you were smart and able, you could get promoted. And, you know, most people didn't, but there were old stories of CEOs who came from the mailroom, worked their way up. But all those services have now been outsourced. And they work, you know, the Ram Jam cleaning company comes in and cleans your building. Those are not employees anymore. The drivers are not employees anymore, use Uber or gig services. Most of them, Amazon employees are not employees at all. They work for Integrity Staffing Solutions, for example. The dignity, the hopefulness, the promise of a future that came with those jobs has gone. And the salaries have gone down. That makes it harder for people to get married. People are less likely to get married unless a man has prospects. That doesn't stop them getting together and having kids. And so you get successive serial cohabitations, many of which produce children, but which don't produce the benefits of family life and structure that people need to make their lives work. And I know I'm an economist, and maybe this is reductionist, but I think the failing labor market has got a lot to do with that. Not because money is everything, but because money fuels these communities and makes it possible to people to live in the patterns in which they've lived for many years. They're not just facing increasing death, but they're facing increasing pain. So middle-aged people now face more pain than the elderly. As an elderly person, I can tell you that pain goes up with age. And the fact that middle-aged people have more pain than the elderly is because they've had more pain throughout their lives. That pain is just going up and up. Socializing is going down. Self-reported health, disability are all worsening, but only for the people without a 4-year college degree. You have a college degree, you seem to be exempt from this. Declining marriage rates for people without a 4-year college degree. The serial cohabitation I've talked about. There are no unions anymore. Now, people have very divided opinions about unions, but unions raise people's wages. They monitor workplace conditions, which the federal government is supposed to do, but doesn't always do. And they provided political representation for people, both locally and in Washington. They also provided a lot of social life. My friend Bob Putnam wrote a very famous book called Bowling Alone. The guy who was bowling alone was bowling in a union hall. That union probably doesn't exist anymore, and I'm sure the hall doesn't exist anymore. Church going has declined across all the denominations, even the evangelical denominations that rose for a long time are now declining quite rapidly. And again, that decline is much more rapid for people without a BA. So these people, these less educated, because they're not uneducated, they may have associate's degree or high school degree, are adrift from the institutional supports which provided meaning and purpose in their lives. They're excluded. Michael Sandel, the philosopher at Harvard, has argued that a BA has become a condition for a good job, for respect, and for social esteem. You could also say it's become a condition for inclusion. So good jobs have become scarce. People blame China. Robots are much more important than China. The increasing cost of healthcare has created chaos throughout America. We can't spend $1.05 in the whole country without undermining all the other things that we need, all the infrastructure, all the education, all the rest of it. And what's more is, if you talk to CEOs of large companies, one of them told me, they said, our health insurance people came in one year and said, your health costs, your premium for your employees are going to go up 40% next year. And he said, you got to be kidding. And he said, no, that's what the insurers tell us. And they said, well, we can't pay that. And they said, okay, call in McKinsey. They'll tell you what to do. McKinsey comes in, and they basically fire most of their low-paid workers. Now, if you're a middle-paid or CEO or executive, the $20,000 premium, which that's what it costs for a healthcare premium, family premium, has to be paid by either the worker or by the employer. That $20,000 is nothing on a $100,000 salary. But if the salary is $25,000 a year, $20,000 is just impossible. And that's one of the main reasons why these people are being kicked out into gig jobs and why employers won't hire them anymore. Another part of exclusion is that their political influence has declined. People think there's always been lobbying in Washington, and so there has, but there's been an enormous growth since 1970 in corporate lobbying. And so this control of the higher reaches of capitalism over Washington is much different now from what it was 30 or 40 years ago. 1970, in some sense, is the key pivot in this story. It's when, for working class America, things started seriously going wrong. And so many of these people believe that the system is rigged in favor of a cosmopolitan, educated elite that is benefiting from globalization while they lose. And they feel that they're basically sheep that are being fleeced by the rich, and money's being transferred upwards from poorer people. So we got redistribution. And I'm against redistribution, especially redistribution that goes from the less powerful, from the excluded, to the top. So you finish up with a sort of two-class society. I think I've said probably most of this. Oh, here's something that I think is very important and has not been debated enough. Almost all the enlisted men and women in our armed forces do not have a BA. Almost all of our officers do have a BA. So we're fighting wars with people who have no political representation and who are being excluded from many things. That makes it much easier for us to fight endless wars. It's much less costly because no one who's ordering up those wars has to pay for them, and none of these people have their sons and daughters fighting in Iran or Iraq. And this is, you talk about inclusion or exclusion. I mean, we're almost using this two-class society, and only people of the lower classes have to risk their lives to keep the people at the top. I mean, it's enough to, I don't know what it's enough to do. My fellow Scotsman, Adam Smith, has this quote about upward redistribution. He says, "The cruelest of our revenue laws are mild and gentle in comparison of some of those which the clamor of our merchants and manufacturers, read lobbyists in Washington, has extorted from the legislature for the sport of their own absurd and oppressive monopolies. Like the laws of Draco, these laws may be said to be all written in blood." Draco was the source of the word draconian. He was a Greek lawmaker who had a very simple legal code, which is if you did anything wrong, you were executed. So the laws of Draco were very draconian. So I think I'm pretty much out of time. I could say a few words about COVID, or I could stop. Say a few words about COVID. I don't have that much to say about COVID. But, so one of the things that's interesting is the BA has protected people against COVID in much the same way as it protected people from death before. That's a new result that Anne and I are just working on. In fact, if you're aged between 25 and 64, having a BA is about 75% effective against death, sort of like a vaccine. Vaccine you can get much quicker than a BA, though. But I mean, it's this distinction in mortality rates was maintained into COVID. We find it really very surprising. And these other relativities have not been maintained. So Hispanics and African Americans, and especially Native Americans, have died in much greater numbers during COVID than whites have, or Asians, Asian Americans who've done relatively well. Everyone's lost out, but those are the groups that have lost out more. Interestingly, we're beginning to understand that many of the deaths among African Americans were not of COVID, but of deaths that would not have happened if COVID had not been there. I mean, that's still being worked out. At the beginning of the pandemic, I have Azar here, but Trump actually said it. Trump said that if we had lockdowns, thousands and thousands of people would kill themselves. And so you shouldn't have lockdowns. It was better to have the disease than it was. Well, it turns out we don't have all the data yet, but suicides fell in 2020, which is sort of interesting finding, especially in the early days of the pandemic. And even though there was large-scale unemployment, which used to bring suicides with it, this did not happen in the spring of last year. Drug overdoses, on the other hand, increased quite rapidly, but they were increasing quite rapidly in November, December, January, and February before the pandemic happened. So we really don't know what that's about. Alcohol, we don't know, but there's a lot of concern that people were ordering huge quantities of alcohol to drink at home. You know, the Zoom quarantinis, or whatever they're called. There's new data suggesting that weight gain, there's quite a lot of increase in obesity during the pandemic. So they may not have been drinking much, but they were eating. The other thing that's happened, and this is just something I can leave you with because it concerns me a lot. You talk about divisions. There's one that's huge division is very troubling. The US stock market is at all-time highs during the pandemic, which is a very weird thing when you think about it. I mean, 650,000 Americans have died, and the Dow is celebrating it, to put it crudely. And a huge increase in the stock market. So a few of the people at the very top, here are some estimates I took from the press, that Jeff Bezos gained $90 billion, which he spent on a spaceship. Musk earned $68 billion. Zuckerberg earned $47 billion. But it's not just them. It's people like me, older people who have their pension funds invested in the stock market, which didn't used to be the case. I mean, in the old days, you worked for an employer, they were responsible for paying you a pension. Nowadays, you have a 401k, and so the money's invested in the stock market. That money has gone up through the roof like this too. So you've got something, usually in wartime, when people die in large numbers, and people get rich, the manufacturers of war material get rich during wartime, you have very high taxes on the rich because you want them to go on and make this stuff, but you want them to contribute to society. During the Second World War, the Labour Party in Britain talked about wealth conscription to match labor conscription. Their members, the unions, were being conscripted to fight in the war and risk their bodies. The capitalists, you want to go on producing, but you want to tax them. We're not talking about that at all, or at least a very few people are, and it's certainly clear there's not going to be any wealth taxes. I mean, the Biden team is not even trying to do that. And, you know, we can expect that to get more. And here's a final graph. This comes from the Federal Reserve. I didn't make this. This shows total wealth in America in trillions of dollars. And this picture divides it up by education. And you can see the green line, this huge block on the top here, is for people with a four-year college degree. And they now have 75% of all wealth in the United States. This is a third of the population with a college degree has 75% of all wealth. The other two-thirds has a quarter of all wealth. If you go back to what is it in this picture? 1990, it was equally divided between people with a college degree and people without. This includes pensions and cars and houses and your debts and your mortgages, and everything is taken into account here. And so we really have built ourselves a two-class society in which the happy few are doing well and the two-thirds are increasingly not being recognized as full citizens. One of the issues about inequality that I think is the key one is equality of moral standing within society. We want not equality of opportunity, we want equality of outcome. And that's the outcome that we want, everybody to be in equal standing. So you want complete absence of oppression. This is based on the work of Elizabeth Anderson, a philosopher at Michigan, who's been a very good advocate of this in recent years, that what we want is an equality of standing. And I think that's very much what Bishop Frank was talking about. I mean, that we're all moral individuals within equal dignity, and that's failing in America. So I'll stop there.